My name is Elena Ward. I'm 27 years old, and what I'm about to tell you is not just a story, it's my real life. It all began in the quiet town of Willow Creek, a place that on the surface looked like a perfect postcard of peace, but behind closed doors my family carried a darkness I never understood until it was too late. I lost my parents under strange circumstances when I was only 16, and for years I convinced myself it was just an accident. I've since learned the truth. They were murdered, and the one responsible was far closer to me than I ever imagined. This is the story of how I uncovered that truth and the horror that followed. If you're here, don't just listen, stay with me until the end. Subscribe, like, and share this video. This story is written and edited by Dark Lifeside Diaries. The air in Willow Creek had a way of clinging to your skin, damp and heavy, even on days when the sun seemed bright enough to burn the clouds away. I'd returned to my childhood home for the first time in over a decade, dragging my suitcase up the gravel path with every step echoing in my head like a drumbeat of dread. The old Victorian house stood there unchanged, its faded green paint peeling in strips like dead skin the windows. Staring blankly into nothing, my Aunt Margaret had passed away 2 weeks ago, and as the only surviving family member, the property now belonged to me. I'd never liked her much. She was strict, secretive, and always seemed to watch me like I was something she was guarding or hiding inside. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the musty scent of an abandoned house, but something more metallic, faint but sharp, like old blood that had seeped too deep into wood to ever fully fade. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the memories playing tricks, but the further I walked through those creaking halls, the stronger it became. The living room was exactly as I remembered: dusty floral couches, heavy velvet curtains, and that grandfather clock in the corner still ticking in slow, deliberate beats, even though no one had wound it in years. I found myself staring at it longer than I should have, the pendulum swinging in a way that felt too deliberate, like it slowed every time I took a breath. Upstairs, my old bedroom had been locked, which struck me as odd. Why would my aunt lock a room no one used? I found the key in the top drawer of her desk and opened the door, only to be hit by a wave of icy air like the windows had been open for weeks, but they weren't. They were shut tight. The walls still had my teenage posters, but something was off. My bed was neatly made with the quilt my mother had sewn, yet the quilt looked damp, as though it had been recently washed and hung to dry in a room with no sunlight. I placed my suitcase down and turned to leave, but I froze when I saw it scratched into the wooden floor by the bed. A single word: help. The letters were deep, jagged, and fresh. I ran my fingers over them, my skin prickling at the thought of who or what could have carved them. That night I barely slept. The wind outside howled, and the old house groaned with each gust, but it wasn't the weather that kept me awake. It was the faint sound of footsteps in the hall outside my room, slow and deliberate, stopping right at my door. I held my breath, the creak of the floorboards so close I could almost feel the weight pressing down, and then as suddenly as they came, they retreated, fading into silence. By morning, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. I went to the kitchen to make coffee, but the smell was stronger there, metallic, almost nauseating. I traced it to the basement door. It was padlocked, the metal rusted, but still secure. I found the key on the same ring as my bedroom one, and hesitated before unlocking it. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, the air growing colder and the smell thicker. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing shelves lined with jars, hundreds of them filled with murky liquid and what looked like hair, teeth, and pieces of something I don't want to name. My stomach churned, but then I saw it. In the far corner, a small trunk, its lid slightly ajar. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me, but never sent. My mother's handwriting stared back at me, the dates spanning years after she was supposedly dead. My hand shook as I read the first line of the top letter. Elena, if you're reading this, it means she finally got me too. I didn't hear the footsteps this time. They were too quiet, but I felt the shift in the air behind me. The presence of someone standing just close enough for me to sense their breath. My flashlight flickered, and in that momentary darkness, a whisper curled into my ear like smoke. You shouldn't have come back. Spun around so fast that the flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, the beam rolling across the basement wall in frantic arcs until it finally settled on nothing but empty shadows. But I knew I wasn't alone, because the air was still wrong, thick, charged, humming with a kind of pressure that made my ears ring and my pulse race until I could hear it pounding in my skull. I scrambled to pick up the light, my hands trembling so hard I could barely grip it. When I shone it around the basement, the shelves of jars seemed to have shifted, like they had leaned toward me, closing in. Though I knew it wasn't possible, I backed toward the stairs, clutching the letters to my chest, when I noticed something wet pooling beneath the trunk, dark and glistening in the weak light. My mind told me it was water, but the metallic smell said otherwise. It was blood, thick and slow-moving, seeping out in a thin stream that led toward the far wall, where I noticed a section of bricks that didn't match the rest. My breath came in short bursts as I reached out to touch them, and the moment my fingers brushed the surface, a sound cracked through the silence, a low guttural moan that made every hair on my body stand on end. I stumbled back, hitting the trunk hard, enough to knock it over, spilling letters across the floor like a paper storm, each one fluttering as though moved by a wind that wasn't there. Then I saw it just for a second in the flicker of my light, a pale hand, fingers long and bone-thin, curling out from between the bricks before disappearing back inside. My scream caught in my throat, my body frozen in that primal paralysis that comes when your brain hasn't decided whether to run or fight. The basement seemed to shrink around me, the smell of rot and metal filling my lungs until I could barely breathe, and then footsteps again, not behind me this time, but above me on the floor of the kitchen, moving fast back and forth like someone pacing impatient. I bolted up the stairs 2 at a time, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly, and slammed the basement door shut, locking it with shaking hands. My chest was tight, my vision tunneling, but I forced myself to take the letters and retreat to my old bedroom, locking that door too. I sat on the bed and tore open another letter dated just 6 months before my aunt's death. In it, my mother's handwriting was jagged, hurried. "She keeps them here, Elena, the others. She says they're family, but they're not alive anymore. Not really. I hear them at night. If she finds this, she know I've been in the walls." The words made my skin crawl, and as I looked up from the page, my eyes fell on the help carved into the floor again. But now it was different. Fresh wood shavings surrounded the grooves as though the carving had been deepened. Since last night, I didn't hear anyone come in, and the window was still locked. I told myself I was leaving in the morning no matter what, but the house seemed to laugh at that thought, each creak of the walls and whisper of the wind reminding me that I was trapped here until it decided otherwise. That night, I didn't turn off the light. I sat with my back against the headboard, letters spread around me like a shield, but sometime around 3 I heard the soft scrape of something moving inside the wall by my bed. It was followed by a faint, deliberate tapping. 3 taps, a pause, then 2. My heart stopped as I realized it was coming from the exact spot my head had been against earlier. Slowly, I pressed my ear to the wall, my breath fogging the paint, and I heard it, a woman's voice, muffled but urgent, whispering my name over and over. "Elena. Elena, run before she comes." I shot back from the wall so fast I hit my head on the headboard, knocking the wind out of me, and in the stunned silence that followed, there was another sound, soft footsteps, but this time they were inside the wall, moving away from my room toward the stairs. I didn't sleep after that. At sunrise, I packed my suitcase, but when I went to grab my car keys from the nightstand, they weren't there. I tore the room apart, checked every pocket of my coat, even went downstairs to search the kitchen counter, but they were gone. That's when I saw it. My car still parked out front, the driver's door wide open, and in the passenger seat, one of the jars from the basement, its murky contents sloshing slightly, something pale floating inside. I didn't go outside. I couldn't. I backed away from the window, every instinct screaming at me to hide, but before I could decide where, a shadow fell across the front door's frosted glass. Someone was standing there, perfectly still, their head slightly tilted, and I knew without seeing their face that it was her. Aunt Margaret, only she wasn't supposed to be here. She was dead. The figure stayed for a moment longer, then slowly turned and walked toward the side of the house, disappearing from view. My phone had no signal no matter where I stood, and when I tried the landline, the static that hissed through the receiver was deafening like a storm. Was trapped inside the wires. I clutched the letters, my only connection to whatever truth was buried here, and told myself I just had to make it through one more night before I'd try again to escape, but deep down I knew the house wasn't going to let me go that easily. The day passed in a strange dreamlike haze, where every sound felt amplified, the ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs, the groan of the floorboards under their own weight, the occasional sharp snap like wood being twisted until it broke, but I couldn't see anyone when I searched. I stayed mostly in my room with the letters scattered across the bed, reading each one, trying to piece together the truth from my mother's frantic handwriting. The oldest ones were desperate warnings, her begging me to never come back to Willow Creek, while the newer ones were darker, less coherent, as though she had been losing her mind or something had been breaking her from the inside. Around noon, I tried to distract myself by looking for the spare car key I was sure my aunt must have kept somewhere. I searched her desk, her dresser, even inside the old cookie tin in the kitchen where she used to stash random bits and pieces. Nothing. That's when I noticed the back door, the one that opened onto the overgrown garden was unlocked, my first thought was that maybe I could just run. I could leave my luggage, take only the letters, and walk until I found someone or got cell service, but as I stepped outside, the heavy scent of wet earth hit me and the world around the house felt wrong. The garden was still as a photograph, the trees unmoving despite the cold wind. I could feel brushing against my skin, and then I saw footprints in the mud barefoot and impossibly small like those of a child leading away from the door toward the tree line. I don't know why I followed them. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was some deeper pull. I didn't understand. The trail wound through the tangled weeds until it ended abruptly at a mound of freshly turned soil no larger than a shoebox. There was something sticking out from the dirt, cloth faded and torn. I knelt and brushed the soil away, revealing what looked like a small handmade doll, its button eyes cracked, its mouth sewn shut with black thread. The moment I touched it, a sharp sound rang in my ears, like a high-pitched ringing that grew louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. I dropped the doll and stumbled back toward the house, but as I reached the door, I froze because the door was no longer open. It was closed and locked. My stomach twisted as I fumbled with the handle, but before I could think of another way, in the upstairs window, the one in my room, slammed shut so hard the glass rattled. I stepped back, craning my neck, and saw her standing there, Aunt Margaret. Her pale face framed by that thin white hair, her lips stretched into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She didn't move. She just stared at me for what felt like minutes, then slowly lifted her hand and tapped the glass twice before disappearing into the shadows of the room. I pounded on the door, shouting for her to let me in, though I knew how absurd that was. And after what felt like forever, the handle clicked and the door swung open on its own. The air inside was colder than it had been when I left, my breath visible as I stepped back into the dim hallway. My suitcase was gone from my room, the letters too. Panic surged through me as I searched, finding nothing until I heard a soft rustle from behind the wall by the stairs, the same tapping I'd heard before, only this time it was followed by a dragging sound, like something being pulled slowly along the floor. I pressed my ear to the wall and heard a whisper. "She's coming for you next." I yanked away, my heart slamming against my ribs, and nearly tripped as the basement door creaked open behind me. The smell of metal and rot poured out stronger than ever. Against every instinct I had, I stepped toward it, drawn by a faint light flickering somewhere deep below. The stairs seemed longer this time, each step groaning under my weight, until I reached the bottom and saw the source of the light, an old oil lantern hanging from a nail, casting shadows that danced like they were alive. The jars were still there, but now many of them were empty, their lids lying on the floor, their contents gone. In their place, something had been scrawled on the shelves in dark, wet streaks. "Join use." My skin crawled, my brain screaming at me to leave, but then I noticed movement in the far corner. At first, I thought it was just the shadows, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw them, figures pale and thin, their limbs too long, their faces obscured by tangled hair, standing in a cluster and swaying slightly as if to some unheard rhythm. One of them lifted its head, and through the curtain of hair, I saw her face, my mother's face, but hollowed, empty, her eyes like two deep pits. My breath caught as she stepped forward, her voice a rasp that seemed to scrape against the inside of my skull. "It's your turn now, Elena." I stumbled back, knocking into the shelf, sending jars crashing to the ground, the glass shattering, the smell overwhelming. The figures moved toward me in slow, jerky motions, their bare feet silent on the cold floor, and I turned and ran, taking the stairs two at a time until I burst into the kitchen. The door to the basement slammed shut behind me, and this time I didn't bother locking it because the lock was already turning on its own. I didn't wait to see what was coming up from the basement. I ran for the front door, my bare feet slipping on the warped wooden floorboards, my lungs burning with the kind of panic that makes every second stretch into an eternity. But when I yanked the handle, the door wouldn't budge. It wasn't locked. It was as if the wood itself had fused into the frame. I turned to the windows, grabbing a chair and swinging it hard, but the glass didn't even crack. Instead, it rippled like water, and the reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. It was my mother's, her mouth sewn shut with the same black thread I'd seen on the doll, her eyes wide pleading, until her reflection was replaced by Aunt Margaret's grinning face. A sound low and droning began to hum through the walls, vibrating the floor under my feet, and from the corner of my eye I saw movement. The wallpaper in the hallway began to bulge, pushing outward like something was crawling inside the walls, pressing to get out. My heart slammed so hard I thought I might pass out, but instinct shoved me toward the stairs. Maybe the attic window, maybe the roof, any way out would do. I took this two at a time, my hand trailing the banister, but halfway up the wood beneath my feet gave a deep groaning creak, and the temperature dropped so fast my breath puffed white Then I heard its soft childish laughter echoing in the narrow stairwell, and when I looked up, a small girl was crouched at the top step, her skin chalk white, her eyes nothing but black pits, her mouth opening far too wide as she whispered in a voice that was somehow both hers and Aunt Margaret's, "You're part of the family now." I stumbled backward, my heel catching on a step, sending me sprawling into the banister, but before I could stand, cold fingers wrapped around my ankle, yanking hard. I kicked wildly, pulling free, and scrambled into my old bedroom, slamming the door and shoving the dresser against it. The letters were still gone, but in their place on the bed lay the doll from the garden, its button eyes now replaced with what looked like real human eyes, brown just like mine. My stomach lurched as I realized they were mine, or at least they looked like mine, and the doll's stitched mouth twitched as if it were trying to speak. The whispering began again, this time all around me. Overlapping voices, some calling my name, some telling me to join them, others sobbing in low, hopeless tones. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voices only grew louder inside my head until one cut through them all, a voice that was neither my mother's nor Margaret's, but something deeper, older, darker. "Once you step inside, you never leave." The dresser shuddered as something heavy slammed in the door. From the other side again and again, the wood cracking, splinters flying, and I realized I had seconds before whatever it was broke through. My eyes darted to the window. It was the only chance I had. I shoved it open and swung one leg over, but as I did, I glanced down and saw the garden, only it wasn't the garden anymore. The grass was gone, replaced by a black turning void that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, and standing at its edge were the pale, long-limbed figures from the basement, all staring up at me in perfect silence. My mother was among them, her head tilting slightly as she raised her hand, not to wave but to beckon. My throat tightened, tears burning my eyes. And in that moment I understood the house didn't just kill, it kept you. It wore you like a mask for the next poor soul who stumbled inside. The dresser crashed to the floor, the door flung open, and Aunt Margaret stepped in, or what was left of. Her skin stretched thin over her bones, her smile impossibly wide as she reached for me. I didn't think. I leapt, the air rushed past me, the world spinning in a blur of gray and black, and then everything went dark. I woke to silence, lying on the cold wooden floor of the living room. The house looked normal again. Sunlight streamed through the windows. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. For a moment I thought maybe I had dreamt it all, but then I saw my reflection in the glass. Of a moment I thought maybe I had dreamt it all, but then I saw my reflection. I saw my reflection in the glass of the grandfather clock, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't my reflection. Aunt Margaret's face stared back at me, her eyes twinkling with triumph, her mouth curling into that same terrible grin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body didn't respond. Outside, I could see the road and the familiar sight of a stranger's car pulling up the driveway. The driver was a young woman, maybe in her 20s, stepping out with a suitcase in hand, her face filled with the same hesitant curiosity I must have worn when I first arrived. I felt my mouth move, but the voice that came out wasn't mine. It was Margaret's, warm and welcoming. "Come in, dear, welcome home." And in that moment I knew I wasn't leaving. Willow Creek ever. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.